On a quiet January night in 1998, inside a small Amarillo home where local teenagers often gathered to feel safe, three boys slept peacefully, completely unaware that their final moments were slipping away. Edward E. J. Pettit, just 15, lay beside his friends Kai Geyer and Stephen Watson, boys with hopes, routines, and futures they never got the chance to live. But outside that small home, a storm years in the making was about to break. At the center of it stood John Lezell Balentine, a man shaped by a violent childhood, racial hostility, and a bitter feud with the Pettit family that had spiraled far beyond anything he could control. Driven by fear, resentment, and a belief that striking first was the only way to survive, Balentine climbed through a familiar window carrying a 9mm pistol. And within seconds, 3 young lives were gone. What followed was a case that rattled Texas, a manhunt across cities, a confession that stunned investigators, and a trial clouded by claims of racial bias, ineffective counsel, and a lifetime of trauma left unexplored in court. For more than 20 years, the case twisted through legal battles, renewed controversies, and emotional appeals, each chapter reopening the wounds left behind. And when the execution date finally arrived, the story reached its most chilling moment, the last hours of a man preparing for death, and the final message he chose to leave behind. To understand the full scope of this story, we have to rewind to where it all began. But first, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next jaw-dropping true crime story. John Lezell Balentine's story begins far from the crime scene in Amarillo, rooted instead in a childhood shaped by hardship and hostility in rural Arkansas. Born in 1969, he grew up in an environment defined by poverty, instability, and frequent violence. His home life was fractured, marked by physical abuse, emotional neglect, and the constant strain of trying to survive with very little support. Compounding these difficulties was the reality of being a young black boy in a community where racial hostility was a daily experience, leaving deep psychological scars long before he reached adulthood. School offered little protection or structure. Balentine struggled academically, received minimal guidance, and ultimately dropped out before completing his education. With no diploma, he entered adulthood with limited opportunities, bouncing from one low-paying job to another. These jobs rarely lasted long, and he moved frequently between Arkansas and Texas, searching for a sense of stability that continued to elude him. His early life became a cycle of temporary work, unstable housing, and unresolved trauma that shaped the decisions he would make later. Everything shifted when Balentine arrived in Amarillo and started a relationship with a white teenage girl. What he saw as a romantic connection quickly became a source of escalating danger. Her family, especially her older brother, strongly disapproved of the relationship. Witnesses later described open hostility, racial tension, and repeated warnings for Balentine to stay away. Arguments turned into threats, and confrontations became increasingly volatile. According to prosecutors, this feud grew into a central motive that would ultimately culminate in one of Texas's most disturbing and tragic crimes. In the days leading up to the tragedy, the 3 boys at the center of this story, Edward Pettit, his close friend Kai Geyer, and 17-year-old Stephen Watson, were simply doing what teenagers in Amarillo often did. They spent the night at a small, modest house that served as a hangout spot for local kids, a place where they could relax, joke around, and momentarily forget the challenges of school and home. They were not involved in dangerous activities, nor did they have any role in the bitter feud brewing between Balentine and EJ's older brother. To them, the tension between the adults was distant noise, something happening outside their world, something they had no reason to fear. But while the boys slept peacefully in that quiet home, a very different world was taking shape beyond those walls. Over the previous months, the conflict between John Balentine and EJ's older brother had grown into a hostile and publicly visible feud. People in the neighborhood later recalled seeing arguments escalate into shouting matches, with threats exchanged on both sides. Some witnesses described overt racial hostility aimed at Balentine, who felt increasingly singled out and intimidated. Others noted a pattern of confrontations where tensions rose quickly and dangerously, suggesting that the situation had slipped far beyond normal teenage disputes and into something explosive. Balentine repeatedly voiced his fears to those around him, telling friends and acquaintances that he believed EJ's older brother planned to kill him. Whether this fear was grounded entirely in fact or amplified by his own traumatic experiences, it consumed him. The pressure intensified just days before the murders when a confrontation occurred that Balentine later described as the breaking point. He claimed the older brother confronted him aggressively, an encounter that left him feeling trapped, cornered, and convinced that violence was unavoidable. According to Balentine's later statements, his mindset in those final days became shaped by the belief that he needed to act before someone acted against him. The prosecution would later argue that this fear, combined with resentment, instability, and unresolved trauma, formed the foundation of his motive. What is certain is that the escalating conflict, fueled by anger, threats, and racial tension, created a boiling point. And in the middle of that growing storm were three teenagers who had no understanding of the danger surrounding them, sleeping in a house that should have been safe but would instead become the scene of one of Amarillo's most devastating crimes. The night of January 21, 1998, began like any other for the quiet streets of Amarillo, Texas, but for John Lezell Balentine, it was the night that would change countless lives forever. As darkness settled, Balentine made his way to the small home where three teenage boys were sleeping. Using a window he had previously accessed during earlier visits to the house, he silently entered, ensuring that his presence would go unnoticed. Inside, Edward Mark Pettit, Kai Tyler Geyer, and Stephen Joseph Watson lay on simple mattresses, unaware of the danger that had already crept into the room. Balentine was armed with a 9mm pistol, and what followed was sudden, deliberate, and merciless. He approached each boy one by one and fired at close range, striking each in the head. The shots were instantly fatal, leaving no time for the teenagers to wake, scream, or defend themselves. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. A home that had once been a safe haven for friends and laughter became the site of a senseless and brutal massacre. After committing the murders, Balentine fled the home immediately, disappearing into the night and leaving Amarillo behind in a desperate attempt to evade justice. It wasn't until the next morning that the house owner, unaware of what had transpired, discovered the lifeless bodies of the three boys. Shock, disbelief, and grief swept through the community as the horrifying truth sank in. Three innocent minors had been executed in their sleep. In the immediate aftermath of the horrific murders in Amarillo, Texas, law enforcement faced one of the most chilling and complex investigations of their careers. The small home where Edward Mark Pettit, Kai Tyler Geyer, and Stephen Joseph Watson had been executed while asleep became the epicenter of a meticulous forensic operation. Amarillo police cordoned off the property, ensuring that every inch of the crime scene was preserved. Forensic experts moved carefully through the rooms, photographing every detail, documenting bullet trajectories, and collecting evidence with painstaking precision. The walls, the mattresses, and even the floorboards were examined for traces of gunpowder, fingerprints, and any minute clue that could lead to the perpetrator. It was during this process that the ballistic evidence emerged as a critical breakthrough. The bullets recovered from the victims' bodies were later traced to a 9mm handgun, a weapon that investigators would eventually connect directly to John Lezell Balentine. As forensic evidence was being analyzed, detectives turned to the human side of the investigation. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances were interviewed in depth, revealing the escalating tension that had existed between Balentine and the family of the teenage girl he had been dating. Witnesses described frequent public arguments, ongoing threats, and instances of intimidation, painting a picture of a young man who had felt cornered and fearful. They recalled that Balentine had openly expressed concern for his own safety, fearing that the girl's older brother intended to harm him. These testimonies became crucial in understanding both the motive and the mindset of the man behind the killings, providing law enforcement with a roadmap that would eventually lead to his capture. Meanwhile, Balentine had vanished. Within hours of committing the murders, he disappeared from Amarillo, leaving behind the crime scene and the evidence that would ultimately identify him as the perpetrator. Law enforcement traced his movements through tips, witness statements, and connections from his past. It was soon confirmed that Balentine had traveled to Houston, Texas, where he was hiding with acquaintances who had previously known him from Arkansas and Texas. The authorities immediately launched a multi-agency manhunt. U.S. Marshals coordinated with local Houston police, canvassing neighborhoods, checking rental addresses, and following up on every possible lead. Days turned into weeks as investigators meticulously tracked Balentine, piecing together his movements in an effort to prevent him from disappearing further or committing additional crimes. Finally, the effort paid off. In Houston, authorities located Balentine and arrested him without incident, bringing an end to a tense and painstaking pursuit. From there, he was transported back to Amarillo to face questioning. During interrogation, Balentine confessed to the killings in a chilling and detailed account. He admitted that his original intention had been to confront Pettit's older brother, the individual at the center of the escalating conflict. According to his statements, the confrontation had gone tragically awry, and in a fatal misdirection, the teenagers, three innocent boys who were entirely uninvolved in the conflict, became the victims of his violence. Balentine's confession provided critical insight into both the premeditation and the horrifying miscalculation that led to the murders, giving prosecutors the foundation they needed for a capital murder case. The arrest and confession sent shockwaves through Amarillo and the surrounding community. Residents struggled to reconcile the notion that three young, unassuming teenagers had been killed not as the target of the conflict, but as collateral damage in a violent confrontation fueled by fear and anger. Families and friends of the victims were left grappling with grief and disbelief, while the legal system prepared to bring Balentine to trial for a crime that was as senseless as it was brutal. The investigation and arrest phase not only revealed the meticulous work of law enforcement but also underscored the terrifying consequences of unchecked hostility and misdirected vengeance. A reminder that violence, once set in motion, can spiral into unimaginable tragedy. In 1999, John Lezell Balentine faced the legal reckoning for one of the most shocking crimes Amarillo, Texas, had ever witnessed. Charged with capital murder for the execution-style killings of Edward Mark Pettit, Kai Tyler Geyer, and Stephen Joseph Watson, Balentine entered the Potter County courtroom knowing that the stakes were as high as they could be. The potential for a death sentence hung over him like a shadow. Prosecutors presented a meticulously detailed case, emphasizing the deliberate and merciless nature of the crime. They argued that Balentine's actions were not a spontaneous act of anger but a premeditated and calculated assault, carried out with cold precision against three innocent teenagers while they slept. Each detail, from the entry through the window to the execution-style shots, was laid bare for the jury, leaving little room for doubt about the premeditation and brutality involved. The courtroom became a stage where the contrast between the victim's innocence and the calculated violence of Balentine's actions was brought into sharp focus. Witnesses described the boys' personalities, painting a portrait of vibrant, ordinary teens whose lives were stolen in an instant. Experts testified about the psychological elements of premeditated violence and the heightened risk factors associated with Balentine's upbringing, attempting to contextualize, but not excuse, the horror of the murders. Despite the efforts of Balentine's legal team, several key issues later became controversial. Critics argued that his attorneys failed to adequately present mitigating evidence regarding his traumatic childhood, including poverty, abuse, and racial hostility, which may have contributed to his violent tendencies. Questions also arose about the fairness of the jury selection process, with allegations that racial bias may have influenced the composition of the jury and the assumptions they made about Balentine's character. Appeals in the years following his conviction repeatedly raised these concerns, suggesting that the trial may not have fully accounted for the complexities of his background or the systemic issues at play. Nevertheless, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, affirming that Balentine had committed capital murder. The judge imposed the death sentence, a decision that would be repeatedly upheld through appeals and legal challenges. Courts consistently rejected attempts to overturn the sentence, finding that the evidence of premeditation, brutality, and the number of victims justified the ultimate punishment. For the families of Pettit, Geyer, and Watson, the verdict offered a measure of closure, a recognition of the lives lost and the gravity of the crime. Yet for Balentine, it marked the beginning of a prolonged period on death row, where he would wait for more than 2 decades for the sentence to be carried out. This trial and sentencing phase highlighted the collision between human tragedy, legal procedure, and societal judgment, a stark reminder of how a single act of violence can ripple outward, affecting families, communities, and the justice system in profound and lasting ways. Following his conviction and sentencing, John Lezell Balentine spent more than 2 decades navigating the complex and often slow-moving machinery of the American legal system. After being transferred to the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, a maximum security facility housing Texas death row inmates, Balentine faced a regimented, isolating life, confined to a small cell for nearly 23 hours a day, with limited human contact and the constant weight of the death sentence looming over him. The Polunsky Unit became both his prison and the stage for a prolonged legal battle, as his defense team pursued multiple state and federal appeals over the next 20-plus years, attempting to challenge his conviction and sentence on various grounds, including claims of ineffective counsel and procedural errors during the trial. In 2022, after decades of legal wrangling, a brief stay of execution was issued, offering a fleeting glimmer of hope for Balentine and his legal team. However, the reprieve was short-lived as courts quickly lifted the stay, reaffirming the original verdict and death sentence. As February 2023 approached, Balentine's final legal avenues were exhausted. Appeals for clemency, including petitions to the U.S. Supreme Court, were denied, leaving no further legal recourse. The exhaustion of appeals marked the inevitable conclusion of a lengthy and contentious process, a journey through the judicial system that spanned more than 20 years, filled with delays, hearings, and debates over justice, fairness, and the appropriateness of the ultimate punishment. With all appeals denied, the courts officially set Balentine's execution date for February 8, 2023, bringing the final chapter of his legal battle into sharp focus. For the victims' families, the date represented the end of a long wait for closure, while for Balentine, it signaled the approaching fulfillment of a sentence that had hung over him since the moment of his conviction. The final judgment underscored the gravity of the crimes he had committed, the deliberation of the justice system, and the irreversible nature of the ultimate penalty in the state of Texas. The final hours of John Lezell Balentine's life unfolded at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, the state's oldest and most notorious death row facility, where generations of condemned inmates had faced their ultimate sentence. By 2011, Texas had abolished the tradition of special last meals, meaning that Balentine, like all inmates since then, was served the standard prison menu of the day. On February 8, 2023, that meal consisted of baked chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables, bread, and a beverage, plain, unceremonious, and entirely dictated by the institution. For Balentine, it was the last sustenance before facing the lethal consequences of his actions, marking the quiet beginning of his final hours. As the execution approached, Balentine was prepared following the full procedural protocol observed at the Huntsville unit. Witnesses, including corrections officials and selected family members of the victims, watched in solemn silence. According to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Balentine took the opportunity to address those present, speaking both to his own family and to the families of Edward Mark Pettit, Kai Tyler Geyer, and Stephen Joseph Watson. I want to apologize for all the hurt I have caused. I hope you find peace. This was a mistake. I love you all. The statement, brief yet heavy with remorse, served as a final acknowledgement of the lives lost and the pain inflicted. It reflected the culmination of decades of legal battles, reflection, and the enduring consequences of the crime he had committed. Shortly afterward, the lethal injection procedure commenced. At 6:36 p.m. on February 8, 2023, John Lezell Balentine was pronounced dead, bringing to a close a long and tragic chapter in Amarillo's history. For the families of the victims, the moment marked a form of closure after 25 years of grief and uncertainty, while for the wider public, it underscored the irreversible consequences of violent actions and the profound complexities of justice. As the doors of the Huntsville unit closed behind him for the final time, the story of John Lezell Balentine, from a troubled childhood and escalating conflicts to murder, trial, and ultimate execution, was sealed in history. It stands as a stark reminder of how a single night of violence can irrevocably alter countless lives, leaving a lasting imprint on families, communities, and the memory of a state grappling with the weight of justice. If this story gave you chills and made you think about the fragile line between life and violence, don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories. Hit the notification bell so you'll never miss our next jaw-dropping case, and let us know in the comments what you think about this tragic story and the choices that led to it. We want to hear your thoughts.